Kevin. Take it
Thanks,
away,
Hass-
Kevin.
thanks, Hassan. My name is Kevin Berman. I work for First Five Alameda County, and I'm co-founder of the Alameda County Fathers Corps. We've been working with the Family Justice Center Network for, it's been a while now, 6 months at least. We've had several kickoffs. We've had a few trainings. This is our second opportunity to hear from Mr. Arnold Chandler. We start a lot of our learning communities and cohorts and trainings off with Arnold because his trainings really ground us in the why our communities look the way they look, why our families are in the circumstances that they're in, and really the historical and policy decisions that were made. A lot of times we like to blame our families who are quote unquote struggling for struggling. And what Arnold does a really good job of is giving us the behind the curtain on why our families are in the position that they're in, why our communities look the way they look. So I'm going to go ahead and be quiet and turn it over to Mr. Chandler. Arnold.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Let me put my screen up here. Okay, so this presentation is called the Life Course Framework for Improving the Lives of Boys and Men of Color. If you are with us for the last presentation, that was focused on structural racism and a framework for thinking about structural racism. There's going to be some intersection here between this presentation and that one, but what this one is really going to look at is applying this idea of a life course perspective, a life course framework, to thinking about what shapes lives over the course of their lives, rather than just the things that shape our outcomes in the near term. Not just the past 6 months, past couple of years, but from birth on all the way up to our 40s. I'm going to look at key factors that have been driving outcomes, and some of the changes that I talked about in the structural racism presentation will be brought back in this presentation. And we'll look at it a little bit more depth when we talk about what I refer to as ecological institutional factors. And that'll become clear when I get into the presentation what those mean. But the presentation today is, and to Kevin's point about explaining the why, or or providing evidence on explaining why families are in the circumstances where they find themselves. When I was a freshman undergrad, taking my first sociology class, they introduced us to this idea of the sociological imagination. And what the sociological imagination is that the ability to see personal problems that you may have or that others may have as being tied to broader social structural forces and patterns in society. How things that look like it's just about you are actually things that are about society. And it's hard to see that at an individual level. You have to get quantitative data, you have to get bigger perspectives on society as a whole, and you start to see, oh, people who look like this from these types of environments, these types of circumstances, have these same types of problems that I have. And that's in part a big part of what this presentation tries to do, to the extent that we explore and reveal things that explain the why of people's circumstances. But the piece that organizes this is called the Life Course Framework for Improving the Lives of Disadvantaged Populations. That is a heuristic framework developed over a couple of years that I've now been doing presentations on for about things like 15 to 16 years now. I'm going to introduce that framework, and we're going to apply the framework specifically to outcomes of males of color, looking at specific divergences in key outcomes for males of color historically. I'm going to marshal some social scientific data to explain it, but then I'm going to dig into broad social structural patterns that contribute to the divergences and producing what I refer to as a gender-specific cycle of disadvantage that basically started with changes that began in the 1970s and continues to today. And we're going to dig into how that plays out. There's some things that when I did this presentation for First Five a few years ago, some of the things that I was emphasizing then have actually changed a bit later on with new data and new analysis that's come along. So I've updated this. So anybody on this call who might have seen the presentation around 2018 might see new things in the presentation today. Anybody who on this call saw the presentation last year is pretty much saying the same stuff. So I don't want to get anybody's hopes up if you saw it last year. So the life course framework, a heuristic. What does it mean to take a life course approach? It essentially means taking the long view. Taking the long view on what drives outcomes, but also taking the long view on intervention. When we have programs, when we have interventions, we not only want to see them change near-term outcomes, but possibly, as I describe it, alter life trajectories, change the long-term outcomes of a person. We think about how outcomes of a person's life relate to each other, how the early outcomes that you have then in turn influence the later outcomes you have, and they build on each other cumulatively. And how things happen early in our lives shape things that happen later in our lives. It's a very essential a point of the life course perspective. And we focus on changing life trajectories. How can we alter the broad patterns that a person is going to have that's going to they end up in 5 or 6 years? Things like, for example, high school dropout starts in middle school. We can establish with fairly high degrees of accuracy who's going to drop out of high school starting on what grades they get and other behavioral outcomes they exhibit in the 7th and 8th grade, particularly the 7th grade. That transition from elementary school to middle school starts a trajectory that is supportive of high school graduation, or a trajectory that increases the probability of dropping out of high school. And if you drop out of high school, you have a high probability of going to prison, getting a felony conviction, or you have historically. And once you get that felony conviction, it predicts all kinds of outcomes well into later adulthood. So outcomes build on each other, and earlier outcomes have a very significant influence on what happens with later ones. There are 3 building blocks, key concepts of the life course framework. And I'm going to take you through each of these, and I'm going to show you data that speaks to each of these, or at least research that speaks to the meaning of each of these. But I want to paint a comprehensive picture for thinking about a life course. And these 3 concepts are the comprehensive tools for you to think about it. Ecological institutional factors are the social environment in which we are embedded. It's the social and cultural environments that range from the microenvironments, which include our families, our peer relationships, our immediate neighborhood, for example, our classrooms, other types of environments in which we're having direct face-to-face contact and interaction with people. And then there's the macro environments comprised of the larger social institutions, metropolitan areas, for example, school systems, criminal justice systems, human service environment, et cetera, that shape and influence the microenvironments. Ecological institutional factors shape our human development, our dimensions of human development, which refer to our genetic, biological, physiological, and psychological attributes. They're the things that I describe as kind of being under the hood of a person, because we don't actually know what's going on with any particular person on many of these dimensions. Some are more visible than others, but many are not. Our biological, physiological, psychological, genetic characteristics. We often need to use instruments, survey instruments, other type of testing instruments to assess these aspects about people. The reason that's challenging is because folks who have experienced a variety of harsh ecological experiences, harsh social environment experiences, can have the residue of those experiences all within themselves, their body, their minds, their psyches. So, for example, we see kids misbehaving in class who get subjected then to various types of disciplinary actions that might be just behavioral disciplinary citations or get kicked out of school. There are kids being expelled from kindergarten, as you all may know, or preschool, which is stunning. But what you find, however, is that when you dig beneath the surface, you see those kids had serious adversities that they've experienced or significant traumas earlier in life that underlie the behavior. We don't see that trauma. Kids don't wear hats that say that. Many of us don't wear hats that indicate our traumas. We only see the overt things that they demonstrate the behaviors, and that's what gets responded to in the social environment. So dimensions of human development are very important. They're a very important imprint of experience that then shapes the long-term outcomes we will achieve in our lives. And there's a feedback loop between dimensions of human development and our environments. But our environments also shape and define what I call life course outcomes. The concept of a life course outcome is meant to be cross-disciplinary in the sense that it's supposed to encompass a variety of things that are usually siloed into particular disciplines, like our health outcomes, or our education outcomes, or our work outcomes, or our housing outcomes or our income outcomes. In real life, none of those outcomes are actually separated into disciplinary boundaries. They're all interconnected with each other. They influence each other mutually in a positive or negative way. But our way of looking at outcomes, unfortunately, has been confined to disciplinary boundaries, which prevents us from desiloizing our view of the world and how many of these outcomes interact. So I don't talk about outcomes in terms of those groupings. I just talk about outcomes as single ideas that reflect our behavioral outcomes within institutional contexts. They are also been described as socio-structural achievements. And what I mean by that is the outcomes that trigger institutional responses or around which there are institutions that try and react or influence those outcomes. Just take our educational outcomes. Those are actually produced by institutions that actually prescribe what our outcomes should be. We have to obtain and perform within parameters within institutions that channel us from preschool all the way up to graduating from high school by law, and then all the way up subsequently to potentially through college or grad school, et cetera. Those outcomes we achieve are within an institutional channel. Other outcomes trigger other types of institutional responses, say delinquency outcomes or adult crime outcomes. Those outcomes are trigger an institutional response of prohibition, a system that's designed to suppress those behaviors and results in channeling people into institutions of control. And we're going to talk about that later when we talked about the three ideas of structural racism, institutional, spatial, the mechanisms of exclusion, exploitation, and control, the suppression of behavioral outcomes that society doesn't want to occur results in people being labeled, involved in institutions that then structure the rest of their outcomes over their lives. So an array of outcomes, you just go through the outcomes that you might think happen in a person's life and ask yourself, is there an institution that's devoted to influencing or affecting that outcome? Our mental health outcomes, our substance abuse outcomes, our housing outcomes, whether we work, you can go down a litany of things, and they're not just discrete outcomes that exist out there in the world separate from society. There are institutions that try and shape, govern, and influence those outcomes. And many of these outcomes, we have entire systems that are devoted to moving in positive directions. The types of examples of these outcomes are things like readiness for school, whether or not we are a delinquent as a child, whether we graduate from high school, whether we complete college, whether we are incarcerated in adulthood. All of these are life outcomes that span disciplinary boundaries. And so we should talk about them in terms of the outcome idea versus grouping outcomes together and saying, these are your health outcomes, these are your employment outcomes, especially because many employment outcomes turn out to be importantly influenced by health and vice versa. There's also a feedback loop between our environments and our outcomes, and there's a feedback loop between our dimensions of human development and our outcomes. Our dimensions of human development undergird our outcomes. And we're going to talk about what those aspects of human development are, but our genetic, biological, physiological, psychological aspects of who we are influence our ability to achieve or not achieve particular behavioral outcomes within institutional constraints. And there's a feedback loop that exists between those as well. But life outcomes, to simplify, are really the meeting of our environments with our patterns of development and the added ingredient of agency, or the ability to act and influence in our environment. But agency has often been talked about as something that's separate from human development. Agency is something that is an aspect of human development. Philosophers, economists, some social scientists talk about agency as if it's how some of this discrete ability to have control or exert influence over your environment. But control and influence over your environment is shaped by human development. And to put that in perspective, think about the type of agency that can be exercised by an infant compared to the type of agency that can be exercised by a 6-year-old or a 15-year-old or 25-year-old or 40-year-old. All of our agency is situated within constraints of their environments. They are undergirded by our human capacity. And that in those contexts, that's when we have choice, in theory, to do one thing or the other. But the idea that agency is somehow disconnected from our environments and our human development is a false notion that some folks who want to blame the victim for their outcomes often resort to. Dimensions of human development, the first building block of the life course framework. Dimensions of human development includes all the things I mentioned before, the genetic, biological, physiological, but everything that I'm going to put on this next slide is connected to a study or several studies that says this aspect of human development predicts or causally influences our long-term life outcome, our physical health, our cognitive development, our mental health and sense of well-being, our socio-emotional development, our identity development, our beliefs, content, and cultural knowledge, our meaning making, and spiritual development, our moral development, and personality. All of these things that are separated by commas within these categories that I've grouped just so we can view them simply, predict or shown in prospective longitudinal studies to predict later outcomes, sometimes outcomes 20, 30, 40 years after we've measured that aspect of human development. So they exert a long-term significance. Now, historically, and in large part because of what I characterize as the imperialism, the disciplinary imperialism of economists, we've spent a lot of time emphasizing the importance of cognitive development as being the primary driver of long-term outcomes. These things over here, like our IQ scores, fluid and crystallized intelligence, information processing, executive function, et cetera. These cognitive aspects have been lifted up within economic studies as being the key drivers of long-term outcomes. And we've invested time in trying to improve cognitive outcomes. Or you have other folks like Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, who came up with a book called The Bell Curve that said our cognitive abilities determine all of our outcomes and they structure inequality. There's no point in trying to help people because intelligence determines who ends up at the bottom and who ends up at the top. And of course, that was their argument was that's why Black people are at the bottom of the hierarchy because they're less intelligent, and white people are at the top is because they're more intelligent. Other folks who try and embrace this idea that cognition or intelligence is a primary determinant of our long-term outcomes. But evidence has come along lately to significantly challenge those ideas. There's evidence that socio-emotional development rivals cognitive development in predicting long-term outcomes. Our emotion and behavior regulation, our self-determination, our motivation, our self-monitoring, et cetera. There's also growing evidence that our identities are crucially important in shaping our long-term outcomes. The meaning that we draw from the world, how we interpret ourselves and the world around us, the inferences about ourselves that we draw, turn out to be extremely important in affecting long-term outcomes. One of the things that's emerged as being an important aspect of identity and meaning that influences our outcomes, particularly for kids of color, is something called stereotype threat, which I talked about in the last presentation. The evidence shows that stereotype threat significantly suppresses natural or latent ability. Cognitive abilities and other performative abilities are suppressed by the belief that your performance on task will confirm stereotypes about your racial, ethnic, or gender group. And so that evidence is showing that actually, no, it's not cognitive abilities. Cognitive abilities are actually being suppressed by aspects of identity introduced into the environment. So these are all aspects, I'm not going to go into each of these, but these are all aspects of a human being that evolve and develop at different times, but become important contributors to influencing our lifelong outcomes. So anybody who's out there who's trying to distill success down to one or two things, there's a book called Grit, for example, that tries to say this idea of grit is a major underpinning and contributor, for example, to long-term positive outcomes. Well, there's a couple problems with that. One, anybody who's trying to tell you that one thing or two things are the major drivers of long-term outcomes are generally full of crap. So let's start there. Anybody who's trying to zero in saying, if you really just influence these things, you'll get success. It turns out a lot of things contribute to our long-term success. The second thing, the second specific problem with grit is that grit has been shown to be indistinguishable from a facet of a personality characteristic called conscientiousness. Conscientiousness has been around for a long time in personality psychology. These are considered stable traits of individuals: our openness, our conscientiousness, our agreeableness, our neuroticism, which are all predictors of long-term outcomes. The one predictor that's not, the one aspect of personality that's not a long-term predictor of long-term outcomes is extroversion. That's the fifth of what are called the big five personality traits. Extroversion is not a strong predictor of long-term outcomes. So if you're an introvert, you can take heed in that it doesn't, you don't have to be an extrovert to win the game of life, if you will. But openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism all matter. And it turns out that when social psychologists, psychometricians have looked at the meaning, the definition, measurement of grit, they basically found that grit is the same thing as conscientiousness. So it's not even a new idea. But secondly, conscientiousness is very difficult to modify. It's very difficult to change in people. And so if you're saying that this aspect of people that develops early and doesn't change substantially is really the thing that drives long-term outcomes, what you're really saying is that we're kind of stuck with the fate of our personality characteristics. We're going to end up where we're going to be, but that's not true. Other things beyond our personality shape our long-term outcomes. And so much of the stuff that tries to distill human beings down to one or two characteristics generally is misguided and wrong-headed. You can think about all these aspects of a human being, these dimensions of a human being, as being like what I call on an equalizer, like this. Physical health, cognitive development, mental health, socio-emotional development. And when your slides on this hypothetical equalizer are pushed to the top, they're at the top, that constitutes a protective factor. That means that aspect of human development is going to positively predict long-term outcomes or predict positive long-term outcomes. And when that aspect of who we are is pushed down to the bottom, it becomes a risk factor. It becomes something that predicts negative long-term outcomes or works against our long-term outcome life course. We as a human being have our particular configuration of our equalizer at any particular time. When we start our lives, you could imagine that all of our slides and our equalizer are pushed up to the top. Let's just say we begin our lives very well taken care of. We start with all the advantages of life, and many of these aspects of human development have been pushed up to the top, and we proceed through life with that strong start. That is one of the best possible places to start, even if adversity happens later. Let's just say in adolescence, we go through extraordinary trauma, terrible things happen to us, and many of the slides that used to be at the top are now being pushed down to the bottom. In fact, some of these slides don't actually move early in life because they haven't really developed yet. Identity development doesn't really kick in until adolescence. Socio-emotional development starts early, but it really kicks in a significant way as we move into middle childhood and to adolescence. Cognitive development and physical health begin in significant ways, in enormous ways in the first few years of life, as you all probably well know from the evidence on the development of the brain, et cetera. So all of these things have different potencies. They're called different windows of plasticity at different times where these aspects of human development really get moving. Some of the slides might not move that much. Identity, because it doesn't really start developing till later as a slide, it's kind of stuck here in the middle for the first few years. You get into adolescence, this slide starts to get a lot more moving. And it may move up significantly or move down significantly if we have views of ourselves that we hold ourselves in poor regard or view ourselves as having spoiled or deprecated identities in life. And so as you think about yourself being represented by this equalizer, you start with your life with a particular configuration. You go through your life and it influences that configuration in significant ways that can cause positive outcomes to occur in the long term or more likely to have negative outcomes occur, or it's what's usually the case is a mix of both. I'm going to put this conceptual equalizer that represents us, that represents you on a life course canvas. We're going to come back to this life course canvas later, but what we look at on this life course canvas are the life course outcomes that happen across our lives as we move through time and move through age. As we get older, different aspects of us in early childhood are in rapid development, different aspects of us are not. As we get into adolescence, some of those things that were in rapid development early on slow down, and other things become much more rapidly developing and evolving. There's greater plasticity at different ages in life. Once we get around to our 40s, most of our aspects of human development have become very settled. And so our equalizers don't move a great deal once we get up into that age span, once we get up into early adulthood, say in our 30s to our 40s. We're kind of really defined developmentally. And later on, we start to evolve and adapt with aging, the loss of certain developmental competencies and so forth. But the life course canvas, keep in mind, is something that we'll return to. Ecological institutional factors are the environment in which we are embedded that shape our dimensions of human development. They're the things that influence whether those equalizers are moving in a positive or negative direction. They include all the micro and macro environments that are structured and shaped by institutions. If we want to look at the life course canvas again, I'm going to put the equalizer back on here with some age spans represented. And by the way, these age spans, just so you know what they are, 0 to 5 is early childhood, 6 to 11 is referred to as middle childhood, 12 to 18 is referred to as adolescence, although people are extending adolescence all the way up through the mid-20s. But for folks to separate them, 19 to 25 is generally referred to as emerging adulthood. And then 26 to 35 is considered early adulthood. And then adulthood really is defined as something that becomes firmly established by the time you're in your late 30s and early 40s. But we have this equalizer, so this is us. And as we move through our life course, we move embedded within what I call the tunnels. So one thing, a shorthand my colleague came up with for this presentation is equalizer, tunnels, and dots is what I use to represent all the major ideas. Equalizer is dimension of human development. The tunnels are the environments in which we are embedded that are semi-nested. Our family environment, our place, peers, and school environment, the public systems that we interact with, and the broader society and culture in which we are embedded. As we move through the life course, we move through these nested tunnel environments. They stay with us. But things like our family, for example, are extremely influential in the first few years of our lives, especially before we enter school. Most of the outcomes that we develop early in life, most of our patterns of human development early in life are shaped and mediated through what's happening in our family context, our family environment. But once we get into middle childhood, once we enter early childhood and start attending school, but particularly middle childhood and adolescence, we start to get much more exposure to the broader environments beyond the family context, our peers, what's happening in our schools, our place environments, the neighborhoods that we live in, and the neighborhoods that we visit on a regular basis for recreation, to interact with family members, other places that we are involved in the broader society. The public systems we start to interact with early in life, the public systems we experience often have effects that are mediated through our family environments, but we start to directly interact with public systems when we become adolescents or in middle childhood. We start to see and directly interact with, for example, policing, police institutions, criminalizing institutions that we'll talk about later, businesses, jobs, employment, all those types of things become things that become more prominent in our lives as we become adults. So these different tunnels become more potent at different aspects of our life, but we still interact with, draw support from our family well into middle and old age as we move through our life course. Now, I've distilled down some of the major, and I don't know why my PowerPoint does this, but it does these weird things that all appear on the slides, that little white jagged thing. But basically, what I've distilled down in this presentation are some of the most salient ecological institutional factors that shape our long-term life outcomes. The things that consistently are found in longitudinal studies that show that these aspects of our environment influence the outcomes we might obtain, whether or not we're ready for school, whether or not we get good grades in middle school, whether or not we complete all our courses necessary for college and high school, whether or not we graduate from high school with a good GPA, whether we go to college, or whether or not we end up engaged in delinquency, develop substance abuse problems, end up incarcerated, for example, end up long-term unemployed, end up dying prematurely. These environments influence all of those life outcomes based upon a broad view of the research literature. For family environments, things like the income of our family, or whether we grow up in poverty, persistence of childhood poverty. It's not just poor at a particular snapshot, it's how much of your childhood you actually spend below the poverty level. The average Black child, for example, spends 50% of their life, of their childhood below the poverty level. And so a substantial share, and I think the number is like 4%, for white kids spend 50%, spend half their life below the poverty level. So very wide differences, not just moments in time that you might have been poor, it's how long you are consistently poor. The age of your parents when you were born, particularly the age of your mother, influences long-term outcomes. The early childhood environment, especially the first couple of years, is strongly influential. Whether you experience child maltreatment, either neglect or abuse, the educational attainment of your parents, whether or not they graduated high school or graduated college, whether or not your parent was incarcerated. The death of a family member is also important. The death of a parent, the death of a sibling. Child housing instability, moving a lot or finding yourselves in homelessness or near homelessness on several occasions in childhood. School mobility, changing schools, particularly during the early school years of your life. The wealth that your parents have accumulated. There's a life course pattern to wealth accumulation, and these are not all the things I get in this presentation. I get into it in much more depth in a later study. But if you look at patterns of wealth accumulation, we look at wealth gaps, for example. We look at the average wealth gap between families. But one thing that conceals is when people accumulate wealth. White folks, for example, have wealth fairly early in their lives. In general, white folks have the same wealth level in their 20s that Black folks have in their 40s or 50s. The implication of that is that if you start early with wealth by the logic of the economic system accumulates on itself. It grows over time. Wealth provides access to places that you can't get to unless you have wealth, like buying a home in a very good school district that doesn't have affordable rental housing. If you want to get into that school district and you want your kids to be able to enjoy those opportunities, wealth is critical for that. If you want to prevent yourself from losing your home or ending up jobless or severely curtailing your ability for consumption, like what you can afford to eat, what you can afford to do throughout your life, wealth is a stabilizer. Wealth prevents that. So if you're out of a job for 6 months, you're okay because you can draw on the wealth accumulation that you have. The ability to have this in your 20s means your kids spend a lifetime of their childhood being buffered by the experiences of wealth. They get to, they don't have significant downgrades in income because you've got wealth. They get access to environments you can't otherwise get access to because you can buy your way into it with wealth. The problem with Black folks, for example, having similar wealth to white folks in their 20s when they reach their 40s and 50s is that their kids are all grown. So they're not able to transfer in their kids' environments the benefits of having wealth until their kids have already left the home. And so that often means that kids they're not able to transmit the benefits of wealth they've obtained in their 40s and 50s to their kids, because most of the benefits of wealth are having your family have it when you're young, not having it when your parents are in their 60s and 70s and you get an inheritance. The biggest impact of wealth are when your parents own the ability to buy you access to good environment and prevent you from losing access to those environments when a family experiences an economic downturn. Family instability is also an important predictor of long-term outcomes. That's reflected in things like parental divorce. Single-parent families was lifted up for a long time as an important factor in shaping outcomes. It has some importance, but much less importance than it's historically been given in both scholarship and public policy. And I'm going to talk about this later on. But what is actually matters more, what studies have shown, is that it's not so much whether or not you're in a single-parent family that negatively impacts your outcomes. It's whether or not you experience family instability. So if you are consistently in a single parent family over the duration of your childhood, meaning you're with your mother and she doesn't have any new partners throughout your childhood, that generally is a much better scenario than if you're in a single parent family and male potential father figures come into the household and contribute to or become involved in parenting the child. That actually turns out to be worse in terms of outcomes, particularly for boys long-term, than if there are no additional partners. The moving in and out of new family members, new parental family figures, is very damaging to long-term outcomes for kids, particularly for boys. And so it's much more about family instability, divorce from a married household, for example, being particularly salient in this regard, than it is growing up in a single parent family for the duration of your childhood. Food security is another family-related factor that predicts long-term outcomes. And then parental attention expectation and parental skills. Those have also been shown to be strong predictors. So these are a short list of things that I found particularly robust using a long-term important longitudinal data set analyzing long-term outcomes. And so that's why I list these. But you can conceivably introduce other aspects of family environments that might contribute to long-term outcomes that I don't list here. I just focus on those that have a lot of evidence behind them. School environments, the funding of our schools, the poverty of the students in the school, the quality of the teachers, the sizes of classes, the racial match between teachers and students, developmental relationships that are formed with caring adults in those schools, the climate of the school, the interaction, the climate generally refers to interaction between teachers and students, interaction between students and each other's, between students, and then the broader rules, procedures, et cetera, about that school environment. The instructional pedagogical practices within the school, the curricula that are utilized. We've seen more recent evidence showing that ethnic studies as a curricula has a very potent effect on long-term educational outcomes for kids of color. They tend to do better on their math and their English and their social studies courses if they take an ethnic studies course, because they find meaning and identity reflected in the curriculum in a way that you don't see without an ethnic studies course included in the school. School disciplinary practices is another one that happens in schools that can affect outcomes. All of these have been shown in quite a bit of evidence as being predictors of long-term outcomes, particularly educational outcomes. Peers and mentors, our school peer groups, our neighborhood peer groups, the mentors that we get, the formal and informal mentors, the networks that mediate our access to jobs. Most employment today is driven by who you know, especially jobs that pay well. We find them through word of mouth, through connections. It's rare. In fact, I think the numbers are like less than 20% of people find jobs, especially good paying jobs, through just finding a job listing or cold calling or other ways of not having a warm connection to the place. It's mostly through connections that we find access to employment. And that's reflected in this notion of social capital. Bridging and bonding capital is two ideas. Bridging capital is the type of capital that connects you to jobs. It's the people that you know. You don't spend a lot of time with. You don't go out for drinks or for dinner or spend a lot of time on weekends with, but you reach out to you and they tell you about a job that's happening over here, or you reach out to them and ask them and they happen to mention and connect you to somebody. That's what's referred to as bridging capital, or what are called weak ties. Bonding capital are the people that we're close to, that we spend a lot of time with, that primarily provide various forms of socio-emotional support, or they provide even resources in times of need. They're there for us through thick and thin. We may call them family, the people that we interact on a more closely, on a closed-in basis, that provide the social-emotional support relationships, for example, that are listed there. So peers and mentors, our networks become crucial. The public system, place used to say neighborhoods, but it turns out that the meaning of place is much more elastic than the idea of neighborhood. And what I mean by that is neighborhood generally refers to the environment immediately surrounding your residence. And when we're talking about kids, that's a very limited perspective on where things are influences outcomes for kids, because studies that are referred to as routine places of activity studies have found that kids spend a lot of time, in fact, in some cases, most of their time outside their immediate geographic neighborhood. They go to a lot of other neighborhoods across the city. There is a study done in the city of Los Angeles that looked at kids from high poverty, concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods and kids from more affluent neighborhoods. And they mapped where these kids go on a regular basis throughout the day, throughout the year, and over time. And what they found was interesting. They found that kids from concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods visit other neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage on a regular basis. They go to these, it's kind of like these islands, like an archipelago of pockets of disadvantage that these kids circuit through across the city. So if you were to measure just what's happening in their neighborhood around their house as the environmental influence of neighborhood on their outcomes, you would underestimate how important neighborhood is, because these other places are also influencing their outcomes. Oftentimes, kids experience violence, they experience being shot, they experience engaging in criminal activity and delinquency in places that aren't their immediate neighborhood, in other environments. And so if you don't account for those environments, you are underestimating how important where people live and spend their time is on their outcome. Also in that LA study, when they looked at these more affluent kids, what they found is that they didn't really cross paths in these disadvantaged archipelagos. They circuited other neighborhoods of affluence. They visited other places of advantages, and the two kids really didn't cross paths very much, except maybe in public places like malls or other general aggregation points. But for the most part, these kids lived in entirely different worlds, even though they were traveling outside of their neighborhood quite a bit. And so that's important to think about when you think about place, when you think about neighborhood, not to restrict it to just what's happening in a localized neighborhood, but what's happening in the types of neighborhoods these kids visit on a regular basis. So with that said, aspects of those places that we found that matter a lot for shaping outcomes are the concentrated disadvantage or the affluence in the neighborhood. Concentrated disadvantage, just so you know, is a specific statistical measure of neighborhoods that uses census data primarily. The measure includes the percentage of the population that is below the poverty level. That's the measure that's often used for what's called concentrated poverty, but the concentrated disadvantage idea is bigger than the concentrated poverty measure. Concentrated disadvantage also includes the percent of folks who are unemployed, the percentage of folks who are on public assistance, percent of the neighborhood that is children, and the percent of the neighborhood that lives, the percent of the children in the neighborhood that live in single parent families. That is the measure of concentrated disadvantage. And a couple things about the measure of single parent families in that measure. One thing is that the concentration of single parent families is one of the strongest predictors of the concentration of violence. Neighborhoods that have high levels of single parent families disproportionately have very high levels of violence. Part of the theory of why that is because when you have single parent families concentrated, adolescent males in particular generally go unsupervised for large portions of their daily activity because there are not both male and female adult parents forming kind of integrated parent networks of surveillance of adolescent youth. They kind of spend a lot of time with themselves, amongst themselves, on street corners and other places, creating the right conditions for engagement in violence and involvement in underground economies like drug distribution, et cetera. And that is one of the theorized explanations for why that is. But the presence of single parent families in particular, the concentration of single parent families is the key driver of violence. And there's no family group that's more concentrated in America than single parent families. Single parent families live disproportionately in the same places, in the same concentrated neighborhoods. In those neighborhoods of disadvantage, you also see residential instability, people moving in and out of the neighborhood a lot. You see a reduction in what's called collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is the willingness and ability of adult residents in a neighborhood to essentially police the local environment. If they see kids misbehaving, to tell them to stop, or I'm going to tell your mama or your daddy. To do other things that are about controlling the environments around their homes, controlling the institutions in their neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that are even poor, have significant poverty levels, but are high in collective efficacy, have significantly reduced violence rates because adults essentially are forming a village. It's a concept that relates to the idea of adults forming a village, keeping tabs, keeping eyes on young people in that neighborhood. The types of things that if you talk to Black folks that are older than their 60s, and maybe some folks in their 50s, when you talk to them, they will often talk about this important difference between the neighborhoods they grew up in say the 60s and neighborhoods today. In the 60s, everybody in the neighborhood knew who your mother was or knew who your father was. And if you were misbehaving, your parents were going to hear about it. People would parent other people's children in public spaces. It was a different environment as compared to today, where you'll see folks who don't know who the kids roaming around their neighborhood actually are. So violence and crime is a feature of concentrated disadvantage. You also have aggressive policing, which evidence shows is criminogenic in the sense that when police aggressively police adolescents, they cause adolescents to be more likely to commit crime. In other words, policing causes crime for adolescents, aggressive policing in particular. Street culture and underground economy, the presence of a drug economy in particular, but other types of illegal economies that might exist, but drugs being the most dominant. Concentrated imprisonment. The vast majority of people who go to prison come from a relatively small number of neighborhoods, and they return to those relatively small neighborhoods. So a large portion of the adult males in a neighborhood could be on parole, probation, or have a felony conviction. So you have a high concentration of people that are basically locked out of, for all intents and purposes, participation in the labor market or participation in the type of earnings that are likely to support a family. Environmental pollutants in a neighborhood, particulate matter, lead poisoning, highly concentrated in communities of disadvantage, highly associated with long-term health outcomes, but also associated with cognitive and behavioral outcomes, especially lead poisoning. Housing quality and blight, neighborhoods that are in disrepair, vacant lots that are strewn with garbage and trash. Those are also aspects of place environments that contribute to the outcomes of the kids who live there. Some evidence, and I don't, if you're familiar with the greening initiative in Philadelphia, it was a greening experiment where they greened a random selection of vacant lots throughout the city to try and assess what the effect of greening these lots would have on the local residents. And what they would do is that you'd have a lot that's just got garbage in it. Maybe it's overgrown with weeds. Maybe there's an abandoned car there. They would come in and they would clean it all out. They'd plant grass, they'd plant a tree, they'd put a nice little fence in, they'd maybe put some flowers, etc. And they would do this randomly throughout the city and then measure through a survey what was the effect on the local residents. One of the things they wanted to look for in particular was the effect on mental health. And what they found was a substantial reduction in depression, reported depression in neighborhoods that were nearby these green vacant lots. And if you've ever lived between, high poverty neighborhoods and better off neighborhoods for brief periods of time that I have in my life, if you've ever had that experience, you can experience this fundamental qualitative different mental state of walking through a neighborhood where everything is covered in garbage, weeds, and houses are in disrepair, like in West Oakland, when you have burned out houses that had been burned out for decades in a neighborhood. It has a completely different effect on your mental health than if you're walking through a shiny new suburb that's got all brand new housing and amenities, not a piece of garbage in sight. Very different psychological effects of these environments. And what this experiment in Philadelphia and other places was able to show is that not only improves mental health, it also reduces shooting. It reduces other crime that happens in the area. And when they tried to trace why that is, what they found is that people go outside of their houses more when they had a green vacant lot next to their home. And because people are outside more, people are less likely to shoot somebody on the street with a bunch of witnesses. And so essentially that caused a reduction in violence. So people came out of their homes more when they had green grass to walk and play on and sit on. And so housing quality and blight is much more significant than we give it credit for. The neighborhood institutional infrastructure, the presence of community-based organizations, nonprofits, churches, and how they intersect and interact with each other is very important for outcomes of the neighborhoods in that environment. Studies in Chicago by Robert Sampson, they did a extraordinary mapping of neighborhood institutions, particularly community-based organizations comprised of nonprofits, churches, and service providers. And what they found when they analyzed, not only mapped these, but they did a survey, a social network survey of the relationship and connection between actors within those organizations with other actors and organizations within neighborhoods. What they're trying to determine, for example, is your local service provider in a neighborhood tightly connected to churches, tightly connected to other types of a local nonprofit organization? Is there dead social ties amongst those who work in those organizations? What they found that if there is dead social ties, those neighborhoods tended to have strong connections to the political decision makers in downtown, meaning the city councils and mayor's office and different departments of the mayor's office tended to have a lot of, they tended to receive a lot of influence from that neighborhood if those institutions were locally interconnected. And so what that resulted in is more resources flowing to those neighborhoods, more attention to issues and responded to by residents raised in those neighborhoods. In other words, when the institutions were tightly interwoven, neighborhoods got more services, more attention, and more investment by city government. And as a consequence, outcomes were also improved. And so how neighborhoods, how many institutions exist within a neighborhood, but also how they're interconnected with each other matters for outcomes of residents. And last, you have things like the presence of a full service grocery store or liquor stores, which have countervailing effects on neighborhood quality. So a lot of evidence points to the role that place, measured in different ways, has on the outcomes of people who live there. And then public systems are all the things that we are part of, that we try to influence. Our early childhood child care systems, affordable housing, juvenile justice, criminal justice, healthcare, public health, social services, child protection, child support enforcement, and workforce development. All institutions that influence the outcomes of people in communities and shape their long-term prospects for success. And then last are the broad society and culture things, the things that aren't localized to a particular neighborhood, but are present everywhere. We may talk about the fact that there are local things like concentrated disadvantage, but it's the fact that concentrated disadvantage exists in cities across the country, not just in Oakland or in San Francisco, for example. Other aspects of the broader society and culture that run across all of our environments are the existence of racism and implicit bias, racial discrimination in various forms, concentrated disadvantage that rose for the first time in the 1970s and is now endemic across the United States. The rise and decline of violent crime. Violent crime, is concentrated in particular areas, particular neighborhoods, but the puzzle is everywhere saw violence rise and fall pretty much around the same time. And we don't know exactly why that was. We don't know all the drivers of the rise and the decline of violent crime, but we just know it was a national phenomenon. It wasn't just what's happened in Oakland or what's happened in Detroit or what's happening in Brooklyn. It was happening everywhere, rising and falling. Mass incarceration, same thing. We know when that began because it began with a big influx of changes in federal and state policies, a lot of investment in resources. We're going to talk more about that. But mass incarceration also happened everywhere. There were more offenders that were worse than others in the mass incarceration game, like California, one of the worst offenders. But there are others who are also bad, and others who weren't as bad but still played the mass incarceration game. Decline in employment and earnings that's been happening over time. We're going to look at that in just a second as well. Deindustrialization, the disappearance of manufacturing jobs, good-paying manufacturing jobs, and the replacement with low-paying service jobs that ended up seeing a lot of men essentially withdraw from the labor market. Income inequality, income segregation, the broad influence of neoliberalism, particularly starting in the late 70s, early 80s, and continuing through today. Neoliberalism is basically a political institutional philosophy that the logic of markets can do everything better than institutions and organizations can, basically. They're saying that the profit motive and transactions in search of profit will always do a better job than institutions that have been created. So we've seen this play out in the theory that charter schools, driven by innovation and well-meaning people that aren't long-standing educators, are going to do a better job of educating youth and result in better outcomes. Well, the evidence is in, if you didn't know, and they don't. They're worse than traditional public schools. And so charters are an example of neoliberal education that has ultimately failed. And neoliberalism is showing its work much more today than it did in the past. Unfortunately, most of our presidents who've been Democrats for the past 2 years have been staunch neoliberals. Obama was a staunch neoliberal. Bill Clinton was a staunch neoliberal. Hillary Clinton, staunch neoliberal, et cetera. And so neoliberalism is still a dominant ideology across our institutions, but its influence is being challenged in a number of ways by folks who are calling into question whether or not markets do a better job than institutions, especially for particular types of outcomes and needs like education, like healthcare, et cetera. So the last major pillar of the life course framework are life course outcomes. These are the things that are shaped by the intersection of our environments, all those things we just looked at, and our dimensions of human development, our equalizer. So our tunnel and our equalizer interact and shape our life course outcomes with the addition of agency that reflects both developmental capabilities and the particular situated confinements, structurally or socially, that we find ourselves in. But we're going to return to life course outcomes in just a moment. Before we get there, I want to add some data to what I just talked about on ecological institutional factors. I talked about a lot of different things like what's happened in families, what's happened in neighborhoods, what's happened with mass incarceration. Now I want to show you some evidence that shows what those have looked like and how they've changed over the past few decades and why they contribute ultimately, as I'll argue at the end, to a gender-specific pattern of disadvantage. In other words, contributing to specific ways, specific outcomes that are worse for males as a consequence of these patterns. There's also outcomes that are worse for females as a consequence of these patterns, particularly females of color or males of color. But because this is focused on boys and men of color, I tend to focus and pay most attention to what was happening with the male as a consequence of these broader social changes. Some of the major social structural changes since the 1970s is the rise of male joblessness and declining earnings. Joblessness refers to people who have left the labor market, who are not even looking for jobs. They're not unemployed, they're jobless. Declining employment and earnings over the past 50 years has been a major shift that has changed the landscape of opportunity for not only males, but for their families, the families that they form. This long-term trend line looks from 1950 to 2010 in the rate of joblessness. Those who are without a job for the prior 12 months, if you enter no job for the prior 12 months, you fall into a population that's high risk of never having a job again. If you do have a job again, you have unstable employment. You have a job maybe for a year or two, and then you're 3 years off. Maybe 3 years and then another 5 years off. You have extremely unstable attachment to the labor market. So this percentage of males who are jobless is a very concerning number. Now, we've had labor markets that have been much better since 2010. This is the height of the Great Recession, in which we had a lot of job loss. So the labor market has improved substantially for those on the lower end of the labor market since that time. So it's possible that these numbers have improved somewhat, but probably not by dramatic levels. If we look over time, what this tells us is for Black males, which is what this blue line is, 2 out of 5 Black males were out of a job for at least a year in 2010. Major proportion of the male population. And this is looking at native-born males. This matters for the Latino population in just a second. And it's looking at the population between the ages of 18 and 61. And even if we look at what are called prime age males between the ages of 25 and 54, those who are in years in which they have their peak levels of employment for life, we also see a relatively high number. Not as high as this, but pretty high. This is the number for native-born Latino males. And we see that a quarter of native-born Latino males were jobless in 2010. The reason we want to look at native-born is because the foreign-born population has very high rates of employment. That's why they come to the United States, for jobs, for opportunity that's associated with jobs. And so if we look at that population, it's going to lift this number much more substantially. But what we're interested in, and you'll see when we see this when I talk later about mass incarceration, is we want to know what the prospects for those who grow up in America are. For those who are raised in this country, where are you going to end up over the life course if that's the case? And we see that 25% of Latino males will end up jobless when they are raised in the United States. And then when we look at white males, we see approaching 1 in 5 white males are jobless. And these numbers have pretty much consistently risen over time. They haven't changed very much. Now, even though 2010 was a Great Recession, and that's why we had that peak, if you look over from the 1950s to the 1960s, these numbers just keep going up. They don't go down. We haven't turned the curve such that it's declining. It's just going up at different rates of speed. And so 42% may be the same number we have today. It may be slightly increased, slightly decreased today, but it's not turned around. It's not headed in the other direction. And that's what's the alarming reality of this, is that this is what's called a secular trend. It's a structural shift in our economy. And this is heavily concentrated among those who don't go to college. If we break out joblessness in 2010 by education, we see that for high school dropouts, 75% of Black males between the ages of 18 and 61 were jobless. 45% of Latino males, almost half of white males. So almost half of Latino and white males who are high school dropouts were jobless in 2010, fully 75% of Black males. But when we look over at high school graduates, we still see high rates of joblessness for Black males, a rate that rivals what we see for white and Latino high school dropouts. About a quarter for Latino males, about 1 in 5 for white males, much lower numbers if they graduate from high school. And if we look further at college graduates, we see very low levels of joblessness for Black males, 12% compared to 45% for just the high school graduates and 75% for high school dropouts, and much lower rate for those white and Latinos with college degrees. So not only are the rates for Black males much smaller, but the gaps are much smaller as well when you move up to the college level. So college is really a ticket or your pathway into employment, or historically has been for Black males. Less so for Latino males, as we can see, because their numbers look a lot more by what we see for white males, and also less so for white males as well. But the college degree is really the pathway to avoid any period of extended absence from the labor market for Black males. Declining male earnings has also been a structural change. This looks at the change in median earnings from 1979 to 2017. We see that white men have seen an anemic growth in median earnings of 2% over that, almost 40-year period. But Black men have seen a 10% drop in real median earnings. These are real median earnings. So Black men today at the median earn less than they did in 1979. They're able to purchase less, and it's getting worse with inflation. That's taking an even bigger bite out of what median earnings are. Latino men have 11% less, earn less today. So we're going backwards in the ability of what an income can buy today versus what an income could buy in 1979. Put this in perspective, Black men's real median earnings in 2010 were lower than they were in 1950. In other words, for a dollar that you earn, what you could buy, and for the amount of dollars that you earn, what you could buy in 2010 was less than what you could buy in the 1950s. So rolling back in opportunity because of the change in the median earnings that people get, that men get in the broader economy. So declining employment and earnings, the first and most important structural shift that undergirds these other structural shifts that we're going to look at. One of the most important ones in the past 5 decades is the rise of mass incarceration and the war on drugs. Mass incarceration looks like this when you plot it on a chart. We see we had a fairly stable rate of incarceration for the most of the 20th century. And then right around 1972, we lost our minds with respect to penal policy in the United States and produced the most unprecedented expansion in incarceration that's been seen in history. The only comparable example that comes close, but not even that close, is the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, in Soviet Russia, when they started locking up a bunch of people as a broad repressive strategy for the population. That's the only thing that's come close to what we did in the United States over the course of these 50 years. We increased our incarcerated population by 430% over these 5 decades, or these 5 decades now. These numbers are still elevated. Although they're declining, they haven't declined that much. And so this is a massive shift that we produced. And the reason this happened fundamentally is because we decided to do it. There are 2 things that caused the rise in mass incarceration. The first is the increase in people going to prison. To go to prison, generally, you have to have a felony conviction versus a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor generally sends you to jail, the place you go for a year or less, sometimes 2 years. Prison's where you go for extended stays, 4, 5 years, 20 years, or life. So what happened starting in the 1970s and continued all the way up into the 1990s is we decided to change a bunch of things that were misdemeanors to felonies. Now you're eligible for the big house rather than going to jail. Secondly, the increased sentence length. So for the exact same crime you might have committed in 1967 and gotten 2 to 3 years, after 1972 into the 1970s and 80s, now you got 5 to 7 or 8 to 10. We took a crime and we significantly increased the amount of time that you would spend in prison for it. So sending more people into prison and making them stay longer is what caused mass incarceration to explode. A felony conviction and or imprisonment reduces lifetime earnings and employment for those who are incarcerated by 10 to 30%. Now, that's a huge amount, but you have to put in perspective what the comparison group is to these studies. They're looking at those who are essentially dropouts, high school dropouts. And we saw what happened, what high school dropouts' long-term employment and earnings are You're talking about 10 to 30% off the type of earnings and job that a high school dropout would ordinarily get. You're talking about 10 to 30% off someone who might work in McDonald's, who might work in fast food, almost a third of the income decrement from that amount. And this is really a function of people not being in the labor market, not working. And so you're talking about utter destitution. You're talking being locked out of participation in our economy and locked into participation in the underground economy, into the illegal economy where your earning is through drugs and through crime, et cetera. To put in perspective the scale of mass incarceration, 1 in 10 adult males and 1 in 3 adult Black males have a felony record, according to data according to a study in 2017 that used data that I think went all the way up to, I want to say 2015 or 2014. So the scale of incarceration shows up educationally in this extraordinary number that you can see here. So the lifetime risk of imprisonment, this is showing that the percentage of folks who go to prison in their lifetime based upon their educational attainment. What this big blue bar here means is that roughly 70% of Black males who drop out of high school will go to prison in their lifetime. A big part of explaining why Black males who drop out of high school, 75%, end up jobless. Because once they get that felony conviction, they're locked out of the labor market. So a very high level of detachment from the labor market, a very high level of incarceration if you're a high school dropout. If you want to know what the numbers are for California, it's 90%. So 90% of Black males who drop out of high school in this state will go to prison in their lifetime, get the felony conviction, and spend the remainder of their life locked out of the labor market, either having access to only very low paid employment or not having jobs at all. You have, interestingly, much lower numbers here that we see actually, let me show you, first compare apples to apples with Black folks who have their high school diploma. Look at the comparison between these two numbers just for a second. It's mind-blowing. Black males who drop out of high school have a 70% chance of going to prison in their lifetime. Black males who get their high school diploma or GED only have a 21% chance of going to prison. A 47 percentage point difference in the risk of going to prison just based upon graduating from high school. So graduating from high school is literally a ticket out of prison for Black males. When we look at the 90% for California, this number is actually 12%, a 78 percentage point difference. So in the state of California, you drop out of high school, you've historically had a 90% chance of going to prison. If you graduate from high school as a Black male, you only had a 12% chance of going to prison, a 78 percentage point difference in the risk just on high school graduation alone. But when we look over here at the Latino population, we actually see their long-term risk of incarceration is actually lower if they're high school dropouts than white male high school dropouts with. And that might puzzle you since we see so many Latinos disproportionately in prison. And the reason that is because this 20% confounds two different populations. The populations they confound are the native-born population and the foreign-born population. If you look in prisons across the country and you see Latinos, if you find out whether or not they were born in the United States or they were born outside the United States, what you'll find is on the order of 70 or 80% were born in the United States. Those who end up incarcerated who are Latino were those who were born in and raised in this country. The foreign-born population doesn't come to the United States to commit crime. They come for jobs. They come for access to opportunity. They come to be American, essentially. And so they have really low rates of crime. Even if you look at neighborhoods or communities that don't have a lot of Latinos, foreign-born Latinos, and you look with data that looks at the change in those neighborhoods and those cities over decades, starting in the 80s, when foreign-born Latinos move into a neighborhood or move into a city, crime for other populations also goes down. Not only do the foreign-born not commit crimes, when they move into a community, they cause crime for other groups to go down. So crime in the aggregate falls when the foreign-born population moves in. So, you had Donald Trump going around the country telling everybody that, they're criminals and they're rapists, the foreign-born Latinos coming into the country. You have Ron DeSantis passing this law trying to oust every foreign-born Latino in the state of Florida. Today, this is all predicated on a lie, that this population is a population of criminals. The fact is that if you're Latino and you're born in this country, you're born in the disadvantaged neighborhoods that America has to offer, you're given the types of schools that America offers for low-income kids of color, You experience the adversities and the exposure to the risk of being criminalized as an adolescent and subsequently finding yourself on a pathway to incarceration. If you're have all those characteristics, you're going to have a high rate of incarceration. And when we just look at that group, we take out all the foreign born and we just look at the native born, this green bar starts to rise substantially. It starts to end up around the middle here, and it ends up looking like another group that also has high rates of incarceration, and that's the Native American population. The Native American population is highly incarcerated like the Black population, and they have rates that are up here in this range as well, where native-born Latinos are. So the through line across all these groupings that if you're born in this country and you experience the adversities that America offers, especially low-income kids of color, whether Black, Native American, or Latino, you have a high probability of ending up in prison if you drop out of high school. This, by the way, for comparison's sake, this was the risk that a Black male had of going to prison if he dropped out of high school in the 1970s. 15%. Today, it's 70%. A Black male with a high school diploma had 11% chance of going to prison. Today, it's 21%. If you compare these two numbers, you see they're not very different from each other, because dropping out of high school didn't really mean that you were going to go to prison, because dropping out of high school didn't mean you weren't going to get a good paying job. In the 1970s, if you dropped out of high school, you could go work in a factory and make a middle-class wage, possibly buying a home in your 20s or 30s and taking care of a family. It was a different era in terms of employment opportunities for men. So education wasn't the real divide in terms of the risk of going to prison the way it is today. So when you lock up all these men, young men who have children, there's going to be an effect on their kids of their being incarcerated. And the evidence has been growing for some time that incarcerating fathers has negative effects, particularly on their sons. Incarceration of fathers increases their sons' risk of aggression by 18 to 33%, compared to boys whose fathers were not incarcerated but had similar characteristics. Parental incarceration is associated with a 21% increase in learning disabilities. And parental incarceration is also associated with a 41% increase in ADD and ADHD. And those are learning disabilities, and ADD and ADHD are strong predictors of educational outcomes, as are aggressive behaviors. In addition to the decline in male employment and earnings and the rise in mass incarceration that we just looked at, another critical transformation over the past 5 decades is the rise in disadvantaged families. Declining employment and earnings has contributed to growth in disadvantaged families. Joblessness, mass incarceration, and male mortality have produced a sharp increase in single-parent families since the 1970s. Now, when I refer to growth in disadvantaged families, I refer to the stable level of poverty in families, but also the rise in single-parent families, because a family with one earner in poverty is likely to be much more impoverished than a family with 2 poor poverty level earners, or 2 parents that can take on the task of raising children amidst poverty. So these transformations, employment and earnings, and mass incarceration are direct contributors, along with the rise in mortality associated with violence, to the growth in single-parent families. Here is a trend line in the growth of single-parent families. This is the percentage of children living in single-parent families from 1960 up to 2014. We see it was about 20% for Black families in the 1960s, up to roughly half or more by 2014. Here's the trend line for white children, and here's the trend line for native-born Latino children. 20%, the data unfortunately only start in the 1980s, because that was the first census in which people could differentiate between race and ethnicity and report your race as being white or Black and your ethnicity as being Hispanic or non-Hispanic. So we got the Hispanic data for the first time, and we can see the trend line of elevated single-parent families, although not quite as elevated as we see for Black folks. But we see a trend line of increasing growth in single-parent families across the board, even though we've had some slowdown over the past decade for the Black population. We really had a spike through the 70s and 80s and somewhat of a stabilization since then. Now, why does this growth in single-parent families matter? It matters because some evidence suggests that single-parent families have gender-specific effects on the educational outcomes of males. In other words, boys and girls, when they grow up in single-parent families, boys in those families tend to have worse educational outcomes compared to their sisters as a consequence of growing up in a single parent family. We've seen evidence that shows that growing up in a single parent family is associated with reduced college attendance for boys, but not reduced college attendance for girls. So girls are still attending college at similar rates in single parent families as they are in two parent families if they're if they're girls than they are if they're boys. Growing up in a single parent family increases juvenile delinquency among boys, but not girls. So boys are more likely to engage in delinquent behavior, but girls aren't. Growing up in a single parent family is significantly associated with increased behavior problems for boys compared to girls. Boys are much more likely to get in trouble in school, to experience disciplinary infractions as a consequence, and other types of things associated with behavior, especially aggressive behavior. And remember, we saw earlier that having an incarcerated father increases aggressive behavior in boys. Growing up with a single parent family where the father is incarcerated is associated with increased behavioral problems much more among boys than it is amongst girls. Behavioral problems, especially aggressive behaviors, are particularly potent aspects of the experience of parental incarceration for males. And then lastly, a large study that looked at 1 million kids followed longitudinally from kindergarten all the way up to their mid to late 20s found that being raised in a single parent family caused a divergence in academic outcomes between boys and girls. It started in kindergarten. The divergence started happening, and it just grew and grew over time till it manifested in academic outcomes and employment outcomes for boys compared to girls who grew up in single parent families. And we can see some data that looks at this trend line all the way up to age 30. Now, this is not a trend line. What this compares is males to females who grow up in single parent families versus married families and their probability of being employed by the time they're 30 years old. So what we're looking at over here on the left is children who are raised in married parent households, boys and girls raised in married parent households. The red dots are females, and the blue dots are males. And what it's looking at is the employment level by the time they reach age 30 at different levels of that parental household income distribution. So over here are the poor families, and over here are the rich families. And it's saying in those families, and here's the middle class families. And what it's saying is that in any of these families that are married families, boys are going to work more than girls by the time they reach age 30, meaning at any income level, the red dot is below the blue dot. It is over here, it's biggest in the middle, and it's higher over here for the blue dots, the males will be more likely to work than the females if they're raised in a single parent family. This data is based on 10 million children born between the years 1980 and 1982. So this is a large sample study that doesn't have a lot of the problems with smaller samples of say 1,000 or 2,000 kids. This is 10 million, and this is showing the pattern here. That growing up in a married parent household means boys are going to be more likely to be employed than their sisters by age 30, no matter what part of the income distribution their family was in. But when we look at single parent families, we see a very different pattern. At the lower end of the income distribution, below the 40th percentile, meaning low income or poverty, lower income or poverty, girls are most likely to work by the time they're age 30 than boys are. We have a reversal in this gender gap over here that favors males, actually favors females up to the median or up to close to the 40%. And then above that, it's kind of a toss-up. Either males or females might work more, generally at higher incomes, at least in this span right here, males may work more. So this was strong evidence indicating that it looks like single parent families might be causing a significant shift in employment probabilities for male compared to females than if they were born and raised in married parent families. Maybe single parent families are causing this gender gap in employment. And that was a reasonable takeaway, but this was a correlational study. But a lot of people were lifting this up. Another study came along by the same researchers, but now using a bigger data set of 20 million kids born between 1978 and 1983. This is a lot of kids, and they wanted to do more of a causal analysis, do a better assessment of whether or not growing up in a single parent family is a big driver of long-term educational and employment gaps for kids, between male kids and female kids. And one of the things they wanted to use to understand it one of the things they wanted to use to understand was this intergenerational mobility gap that exists between Black and white kids. Now, when we look at mobility gap refers to the likelihood that you'll move up in the income distribution compared to your parents when you're, say, in your 30s or 40s. This was measured, I believe, at age 35. And what this is showing is at a particular income level, what is of a family, this is the parent income rate, what will the child's income be when they hit 35? And what this green set of triangles shows is that no matter the income level of their parents, Black girls will reach a higher income level in the distribution than white girls across the entire household distribution of income. So if they're born in a poor family, Black girls are going to rise higher in the income distribution than a white girl is. If they're born in a rich family, Black girls are going to rise higher in the income distribution than a white girl is. Meaning Black girls are going to turn whatever experiences they have in families into bigger returns in terms of their long-term earnings by the time they're age 35. And this was a stunning finding. No one expected this. It's like, okay, Black girls are turning adversity into better returns than if they're born on the low end than white girls and families are doing. But when we looked at Black boys versus white boys, we saw a completely different picture. White boys across the income distribution are going to end up higher in the income distribution in adulthood, no matter what income distribution of their family when they're growing up. They're going to make more money than Black males, no matter where their families were in the income distribution. There's not a single point where Black males are going to do better than white males, but over here, there's not a single point where white females do better than Black females. The median, just to show you how big this gap is almost $15,500 in income per year. So this is these are large differences in income. And so the Black-white gap in intergenerational mobility that we are seeing, these authors argued, was really a male Black-white gap, not a female Black-white gap. Black girls are doing fine, at least that was the takeaway. Black girls are doing fine, which is a false takeaway. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. But what it's suggesting is that if you want to understand why there's a mobility gap between Black people and white people in America, you need to understand what's happening between Black males and white males, not what's happening between Black females and white females. So they try to understand what explains this gap that's happening between males who are Black and males who are white. Why is this occurring? And they started analyzing various factors. And one thing that they came up with using 20 million kids and census data was growing up in a single parent family does not explain the Black-white mobility gap. And mobility reflects both level of employment and level of income. So it's both of those things. And what they're determining here is, even though we just saw on that last slide that growing up in a single parent family caused low-income low-income males to be less employed by age 30 than those who grew up in a married parent family. What this showed is that doesn't explain it at all. It's not a causal explanation for why single parent families is not a causal explanation for the gap in employment and earnings by age 35. That it's got to be something else. And the something else they found is also that it wasn't parental education or parental wealth, which was another kind of mind-blowing thing. The level of education parents have is not what's driving this gap. Parental wealth contributed only a minor explanation, a minor share of the explanation for this gap. So these aren't really what's driving it. What they found is driving it is the percentage of single parent families in the neighborhood. And just think about that for a second. Now go back to remember when I said single parent families are the most concentrated families of any type in America. They're more concentrated than poor families in neighborhoods, even if they have higher income. I also said that concentration of single parent families is one of the strongest predictors of the level of violence in a neighborhood. What this study shows is that it's not that your parent got separated and that your mother is the primary caretaker for you. It's the fact you live in a neighborhood where that's the reality for all your peers, where they're all in single parent households, where these environments essentially, because there's a lack of a concentration of married households or two-parent households, these environments are particularly inhospitable to the outcomes from males in those neighborhoods. And so the reason that single parent families are so concentrated is primarily because the only places they can live historically and have lived historically is the ghetto. is the most disadvantaged environments in our communities. That's where single parent families are concentrated. If you want to find the highest density of single parent families in Oakland, there are a select number of neighborhoods in East and West Oakland where they disproportionately live, if they still live there and haven't moved elsewhere. If you want to find them in San Francisco, it's the same thing. The concentration of single parent families is probably the most important factor. And so folks that are blaming parents, saying that it's the parents' fault, and I've had this argument with some rich people who, invest in philanthropy, who are making the argument that, it's really the parents' responsibility. This is showing that actually, no, it's not the parents' responsibility as well. You can live in a neighborhood with two parents, but if the majority of your peers have single parents, this is going to suppress your long-term educational outcomes. And this takes employment outcomes and earnings outcomes. And this takes me back to a question that Kevin asked during the last training about more advantaged kids or more influenced kids, actually male, being ensnared in a way that leads them into prison or undermines their long-term outcomes. If their peer environment is comprised of single-parent households, kids who live in single-parent households, even if they have two parents who are educated and working hard, that environmental reality is going to suppress their long-term outcomes. So if we want to address what's going on with mobility, what this study was saying is you have to look at neighborhood environments. You have to look at the concentration of disadvantage in neighborhoods, along with neighborhood income, neighborhood poverty, neighborhood high school graduation rates, and county level racial bias. We're all stronger, much more powerful predictors of racial intergenerational mobility gap than what's happening within a family. A family itself is not the driver. It's the concentration of families at the neighborhood level that is really the driver. And we need to address that concentration. The reason that concentration exists is for everything that I talked about in the structural racism training. We've limited the ability to have access to where people can live, the types of schools they can go to. We've created the haves and have-nots. And the have-nots are overwhelmingly families who are single-parent families living in neighborhoods of disadvantage. Further buttressing this argument and finding further evidence, I looked at data to try to identify how much family factors are associated with behavior problems, delinquency, and violence. And this was what's called a meta-analysis that was a synthesis of 119 longitudinal studies. And they wanted to identify which factors in families most strongly predict behavior problems. And I wanted to see where does single-parent families fit in this story. And here's what I found. Urban housing, living in urban housing is one of the weakest predictors, but it is a family level predictor of behavior problems. The size of the family is a predictor. Whether the parent has a substance abuse issue is a predictor. Whether parents are young, and then single parent families, which they described as a broken home in the study. It referred to both always living in a single parent household, meaning your parents were never married or never cohabited, or parents were married at one point and then divorced. Those both are included here. Look where broken home exists as a predictor of behavior relative to all these other factors that are much stronger factors within families that predict behavior problems. Family socioeconomic status, whether the family's poor or has low educational levels, much stronger predictor of behavior problems than single parent family households are. Family stress, the warmth of the parenting relationship, whether there was maltreatment, supervision and involvement of parents with the kids, how the kids were reared, discipline practices by the family, discord, crime in the family, an unwanted pregnancy, separated from parents. In other words, a lot more things are predictive of behavior problems, much more predictive of behavior problems than growing up in a single parent family is. And we tend to associate behavior problems with kids who grew up in single parent families. Then I looked at criminal behavior, same type of pattern. Broken home comes in here, down way here at the bottom. And then unwanted pregnancy, the size of the family, socioeconomic status, urban housing, foster care, antisocial behavior, discipline, all much more important predictors of criminal behavior than a single parent family is. When we looked at violent behavior, again, single parent family is down here at the bottom. It's just above parental psychopathology, but below having young parents, urban housing, much more powerful predictors of violent behavior than growing up in a single parent family is. So single parent families clearly are not what's explaining long-term outcomes here. They're correlates, but not causes. What's going on are things that the evidence tends to point to is overwhelmingly what's happening within the environment. It's the things that connect to the structural racism presentation that I talked about before. Now, these gaps, these environmental gaps are contributing to gaps that show up in long-term outcomes like high school graduation. We see the gap in high school graduation show up here that is very much tied to what's happening in neighborhoods. But the gap is showing up for all groups, not just what's happening for Black folks. We see this gap in high school graduation rates showing up for white females with their trend line represented here with the dots, and then white males, where a gap opened up in the 1970s and has continued to expand over time. It's reflected also in the gap in college graduation. This is the trend line in high school graduation rates for Black females. From this deficit in 1970 to now graduating at a rate equal to white males in 2010. This is the large gap between Black females and Black males. A gap has existed, a high school graduation gap has existed between Black males and Black females since the 20th century, throughout the 20th century. That's not a new phenomenon. But it's only within the past couple of decades that the gap has started to increase this fast, started to grow this fast, to now this yawning gap. So Black girls were over here, they've caught up to white boys, even though there's been some growth for Black males, especially in the 2000s. There's been a sizable gap between them and Black females. Here we see Latino females, and these are all native-born populations, by the way, with this gap, and now they're nearly caught up to Black females and white males in 2010. Latino males are actually graduating at a higher rate than Latino females in the 1970s. They traded places, and now this sizable gap has opened up to where they've got outcomes similar to what's going on with Black males. So the gender gap is happening across the board. It's also happening with the Asian population, just smaller gaps that we're seeing there. And we're seeing these gaps show up in college. So the gender gaps are existing, and some of the things that we can tie to those gender gaps clearly is not single parent families, but likely has to do with what we're seeing in neighborhoods and the joblessness rate, for example, that we see amongst male parents. The rise in community violence is also a contributor to gender gaps we've seen over time. To give you a sense of perspective, here's a chart I'd like to do to illustrate what's been going on, what's been driving the rise and fall of community violence. Now, we don't have good explanations for why community violence has plummeted, but there tends to be good historical perspective on what caused community violence to grow the way it did starting in the 1980s. So here is Black male homicide victimization rates. And homicide victimization rates, homicide rates are a good proxy for overall violent crime because they tend to be reported. We tend to find out when people are murdered. We don't tend to find out as frequently everybody who's been robbed at gunpoint, for example. That doesn't always show up. So we don't see a lot of violent crime. We don't see all violent crime, but we tend to see most murders. So this is a good indication of how violent crime is moving overall. So what we're seeing here, starting in 1976, violent crime rates were falling for three different groups, I'm sorry. We have the green line, which are Black males, their homicide rates between the ages of 14 and 17. Black males between ages 18 and 24, which is the yellow line, and Black males who are older than 25, which is the blue line. So we're watching the trend line in homicide rates for basically teenagers, young teenagers, those who are young adults, and those who are older than the age of 25. And we're seeing what's happening to these groups as they move through the history of the 1980s up till now. 1982, we have the first Great Recession. It's not called that because the Great Recession was so heavily concentrated amongst Black people and Latino people that it didn't get the billing as the first Great Recession. The Great Recession that happened 2008, 2007 to 2008 is called the first Great Recession because it really affected a lot of white people in dramatic ways. But to put in perspective how dramatic the 1982 recession was, I want you to look over here. I compare the 1983 recession to the Great Depression. And what you can see here is that Black folks had higher unemployment rates in 1983 than white folks had during the Great Depression. That's how bad the first Great Recession was. A massive loss in jobs in a very short amount of time. That was just stunning and was devastating to communities. And this was presided over by Ronald Reagan, who also decided, you know what this is a good time to do? let's cut social safety net programs. So Reagan cut social safety net programs in 1983. So you have 1982, all these folks lose their jobs. 1983, Reagan's like, let's cut back on programs that help people who have lost their jobs. What happens the next year? And look at the trend lines. The trend lines are still falling. They're still falling through these years. And it's something remarkable happens. Epidemic starts to appear a crack epidemic starts to appear across the country. Crack cocaine, this newly powerful addictive drug, cheap to make, cheap to buy, takes off. Small, cheap guns also become widely available, and there's a huge demand for them because all these young folks selling crack need guns, and they've got a lot of money now, and they're buying up guns right and left. And not just cheap guns, they're buying up hardware, major AR-15s, assault weapon type stuff. So what happens to the violent crime rate? Well, you can see right here. Reagan launches the war on drugs in 1986. Violent crime rate explodes for those between the ages of 18 and 24, and for teenagers, for those between the ages of 14 and 16. Their homicide victimization rates take off. But look at the blue line. If you're older than the age of 25, violent homicide rates should kind of continue to slowly decline. So this is a phenomenon that's affecting young males in particular. Those between the ages of 14 and 24 essentially experience a mass explosion in violence in these communities. And this becomes a powerful contributor to the change in educational outcomes over time. One of the primary and strongest contributors to the suppression and the decline in high school graduation rates, or I should say the absence of a growth in high school graduation rates through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was the explosion in violence associated with the crack epidemic. So it wasn't single parent families, because that wouldn't make sense, because high school graduation rates have been rising for the past 2 decades, yet single parent families haven't been falling. So single parent families had anything to do with that. High school graduation rates should actually be falling. They should be moving in tandem with single parent families. What the rates are moving much more in tandem with is the growth and decline in violence. Right around the 2000s, violence starts to decline substantially. It plummets. High school graduation rates start to take off. In the 2000s, we've had fairly stable rates of incarceration throughout this period. So if you want some sense of the rise in violence, here's your answer. This is in large part the answer to the explosion in violence. The fall in violence, we don't really understand though. We don't know why this happened. We're grateful that it happened, but we don't know why this happened. If you go back right around this time, this is when the super predators narrative started to happen. This is literally when Hillary Clinton is talking about super predators out of the White House. And then, embarrassingly so, the data didn't keep it up with that narrative. It started to fall apart immediately, and the so-called super predators quickly ceased to be violent actors over the next decades. So crack cocaine is a much better explanatory variable for the change in high school graduation rate over time, from 1965 to 1985. Black males who received a high school diploma increased by around 6 percentage points before the crack era began, 1965 to 1985. Crack comes along, this progress completely reverses. Between 1986 and 1996, there was an approximately 8 percentage point decrease in the percentage of Black males with high school diplomas. And then the crack era ends. In 2000, Black male high school diploma increases have gone up by about 10 percentage points since that time. So this is the explanation for what's been going on in high school graduation rates, not single parent families. Murder and incarceration rates serve as the mechanism linking the crack cocaine era to the decline in educational outcomes for males. The change in the murder and incarceration risk explains between 37% and 73% of the decline in educational achievement among Black males, depending on where you are in the country. Those cities that experience tremendous growth in crack cocaine experience tremendous decline in the educational outcomes of males. Partly because of violence, partly because males decided that they would rather go sell crack than complete high school because they could get rich doing it. So that's a story that I've taken out the growth in disadvantaged families as probably a primary driver of what's been going on. And I put in the rise and fall of community violence as a much better explanation that fits the data better of a driver of what's been going on. So these contribute to a pattern of intergenerational disadvantage. When you put all these together, declining employment and earnings, the rise in mass incarceration, all contributing both contributing to the rise and fall of community violence, which all have a feedback loop to mass incarceration, declining employment. This cauldron of interacting forces has been in play for the past few decades. But what's important to note about it is that it's concentrated, highly concentrated in particular geographies. In the 1970s, for the first time, we started to see the rise in concentrated poverty, the rise in what are called jobless ghettos, in which the majority of men in a neighborhood had no job. That started to appear for the first time in the 1970s. We didn't see that in the 1960s, where you saw such large portions of men without employment. When you concentrate joblessness, you concentrate everything that goes along with it. Violence, poor school quality, drugs, disinvestment. You bring something like crack cocaine, it's like a lit match thrown into this environment in the 1980s. Mass incarceration then focuses on these communities. It starts to draw massive numbers of men in these neighborhoods into the incarceration system, into prison, giving them felony convictions, and then returning them right back to these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods became over-policed and underprotected, viewed by law enforcement as being essentially cesspools of crime, treating everybody who lives in a neighborhood as a crime suspect. That's what the war on drugs did. It made everybody a crime suspect, no matter what you're doing. You're an adolescent walking down the street, going to school, you're a drug suspect. We're going to use that as the pretense to harass you, to bother you, to assault you. And over time, that type of what's called zero tolerance policing, broken window policing, aggressive policing itself started to contribute to criminogenic outcomes itself. It started to cause crime. The evidence still shows that it causes crime. So you're concentrating this incarcerated population. Today, it's around 19 million people formerly incarcerated residing in these neighborhoods, destabilizing neighborhoods with criminal justice policy, essentially neighborhoods that become extraordinarily inhospitable to the development of children. And when you go back and you look at the neighborhoods that that analysis with those 20 million kids, when they're talking about the types of neighborhood environments that cause the intergenerational mobility gap, it maps almost exactly to these neighborhoods where these concentrated phenomena are taking place. To close this out, to put in perspective today, how different the experience of neighborhood disadvantage is by race. 70% of Black children will live in a concentrated disadvantaged neighborhood in their lifetime, compared to 6% of white children. 70% compared to 6% at some point in their lifetime, not necessarily all of their lifetime as Black children, but at some point, whereas only 6% of white children will live there. The average Black child will spend 50% of their childhood in high poverty neighborhoods. Latinos will spend 40%. Whites will spend 5% of their childhood. So 70% will spend at some point, and 50% of Black children will spend at least half of their childhood there. Latinos will spend 40%, white 5%. And then lastly, intergenerational continuity. 70% of Black children that grow up in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage will live there as adults. They will not escape. They will replicate this pattern for their own children. This phenomenon that started in the 1970s to produce neighborhoods that essentially strangle the opportunities of children, strangle their well-being and strangle their opportunities through the mechanisms of community violence, through the mechanisms of concentrated joblessness, through the mechanisms of eroded and undermined educational systems. We get the replication of those patterns over time. And if you want to map where these neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage are, all you have to do is go look at the 10 steps on how to build a historical ghetto and you'll find them. They're the exact same neighborhoods, the exact same places that were redlined almost 100 years ago are the exact same places today that are the durable places of concentrated disadvantage that operate intergenerationally. So I'm not going to close there because I wanted to close with the last element of the life course framework, and that's the life course outcomes that are influenced by growing up in these neighborhoods. I talk about on-track or off-track outcomes for being middle class by middle age or being upwardly mobile. And you can look at the outcomes that are affected by growing up in a neighborhood of concentrated disadvantage. If we look at stable full-time employment at 250% federal poverty level is our North Star, people who are making around $70,000 a year nationally, I distilled down from longitudinal studies what are the factors that predict your probability of making to that milestone. And the most important predictors of that the most important ecological environment that shapes these predictors are the neighborhoods that you grow up in. They are secure attachment to a primary caregiver, to a parent, attending pre-K or not attending pre-K, being preterm birth or having low birth weight, being school ready or not school ready, measuring both cognitive and socio-emotional skills, being proficient in fourth grade math and reading or not proficient, externalizing behavior, particularly aggressive behavior, being suspended from school, having good or excellent child health, having poor or fair child health, physical and mental health, being absent from school, particularly chronically absent, missing 10 to 15% of the school year, having good middle and high school grades, having poor middle and high school grades as the off track, proficient in 8th grade math, reading, and socio-emotional skills, not proficient in those aspects of development, being a juvenile delinquent, being arrested or being detained, being retained in a grade, being held back, high school graduation, college ready, being a high school dropout, criminal offending, arrest, felony conviction, incarceration, recidivism. And remember, in the state of California, if you're a Black male and you drop out of high school, you have a 90% chance of ending up here. College enrollment from a college with some degree of selectivity, meaning not a private college, a college that actually doesn't open enroll everybody who applied. College enrollment with no selectivity is an off-track outcome to being middle class by middle age. Disconnected from school and work, the population ages 16 to 24 that's neither enrolled in school or employed. Violence, victimization, or untreated substance abuse or behavioral health problem is an important off-track outcome in the 19 to 25-year-old age span. Having child support in arrears, owing money, especially for TANF arrears, having to pay back the government for public assistance being provided to your child. A post-secondary credential as an important on-track, is one of the most important on-tracks. Completing a 4-year college. Stable full-time employment, unstable full-time employment. Long-term unemployment or underemployment greater than 6 months, and then stable full-time employment at 250% federal poverty level. I also, forgot employment in a high-demand industry or sector, not being employed in a high-demand industry or sector. Stable housing instability or homelessness, and then on the North Star, stable full-time housing, being middle class by middle age, or not reaching middle class by middle age. So all these things are tied to studies and multiple studies that chronicled in a report that I haven't released yet called Striving and Thriving, Closing Racial Mobility Gaps Across Generations, where I talk about these things, I talk about these environmental factors, but I really focus in on these outcomes across the life course that are shaped, in particular by growing up in disadvantaged neighborhoods and also disadvantaged families. So when you put the whole life course framework together, it looks like this on one slide. Remember the equalizer, that's us with our configuration of our equalizer slides that can start in a positive way, end up in a negative way as we move through our life course. We have our family environments that we are nested in, our place up here, the public system that we looked at, and we have the life course outcomes that we achieve that are either on track to good outcomes or off track to good outcomes. And this is the whole picture of a life course, integrated life course systems perspective. We move through our life, achieving our outcomes, but are influenced by the environments in which we are nested as we attempt to do so. So I went a little over time, sorry for that. Let's pause for questions. I know this is drinking from a fire hose. I'm sure there are some questions in the chat that I can respond to if Kevin or Noah want to key those up for me, that would be great.
Thanks, Arnold. I know in past presentations, Arnold, you have kind of shared some programs or approaches that kind of help disrupt or protect individuals. Can you say a little bit about what those programs are that kind of support folks with getting back on track?
So that's going to be challenging to summarize in a couple of minutes.
Got it.
The Striving and Thriving report that I mentioned does a systematic analysis of interventions that help close gaps. Let me just put it this way. So when we're looking at racial gaps, you have to look under the hood and more deeper analysis and most of what are called evidence-based interventions out there. A lot of interventions claim that they improve high school graduation rates, reduce delinquency rates, improve grades, improve school attendance, improve college enrollment, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look in detail at the study, you find that, in the aggregate, they improve rates. They actually don't do They don't improve rates for Black kids or Latino kids or Native American kids, or they improve rates better for white kids than they do for Black kids. The risk of using interventions that work better for white kids than Black kids is that if you were to scale that intervention, you could cause disparities to grow rather than to shrink. And so one of the things I've taken on that issue in the Thriving report, and I've looked at different types of interventions that tend to work disproportionately well for kids of color. One type of intervention that I'll mention that'll come out in that report is something that I refer to as meaning-based intervention, which are interventions that aren't about improving skills, whether those skills are cognitive skills, academic skills, or socio-emotional skills, but they're really focused on adolescence. And they're really focused on improving meaning, or the meaning that young people make. So remember last time I talked about stereotype threat, when I talked about the structural racism presentation, that young folks have perceptions essentially that they're not capable because of who they are. And that suppresses their unexpressed abilities, their latent abilities. It turns out meaning-based interventions counteract that suppression. They counteract the effect that a racial identity has on a young person's ability to perform standardized tests, or get good grades, or even behavioral outcomes, or the likelihood of graduating from high school, or the likelihood of enrolling in college. And it turns out they actually close gaps over time because they target mechanisms that specifically affect kids of color, Black kids, Latino kids, and to a much lesser extent, at least in terms of the literature, Native American kids. And so some of those interventions are called belonging interventions, growth mindset interventions, self-affirmation interventions, pathways to success interventions, rites of passage interventions. Now, I don't have time to go into those in depth, but what's good about those interventions is all of them show that they have the ability to close gaps and address some of these outcome gaps that we see show up, let's say for high school graduation and others.
Interesting. When's that report going to be ready?
It's supposed to come out in a month and a half to 2 months.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thanks. Any questions from anybody? Sasan, you got anything you want to add?
Well, first I want to take a breath.
Yes.
And I think we should all take a collective breath. I mean, there was so much information, really a lot of important, insightful knowledge that you share. I really want to thank you, and thank you for this learning opportunity. And I think I actually need to go back and listen and think a bit more deeply about the impact of this presentation. And I would actually like to really share this with all of our partners. We work with a lot of partners in a lot of different sectors, and I think this really should be foundational information that we have to share with everyone. So thank you.
Awesome.
Should be
Thank you for that.
required. I agree.
My pleasure. You will all, by the way, get the slide deck. So for anybody who needs to go back and meditate on particular points, you'll have that ability.
Thanks, Arnold. We had a question in the chat that are you going to charge for the report?
Oh, no, there won't be any charge for that.
No.
And there's a hand up from Corey. Monroe.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Corey.
Hey, Honor, how you doing? That was awesome. I also just
Thank
want
you.
to point out that there are a lot of positive outcomes from a lot of young Black men in America. I mean, you look on the internet right now, there are so many graduations, man, with young brothers graduating and young sisters. So just to say it's not all doom and gloom.
No, I do.
But it's a lot of positive stuff going on, and a lot of young people make it out in our neighborhoods. Just wanted to point that out. Of course, we have a lot of death, but there is some great positive outcomes. I know a lot of my homies who ran the streets are working and making some good money. I mean, thanks to the city of San Francisco, but there is a lot of struggle, but just letting it be known that there are some great positive outcomes. And a lot of times the news don't show it. Like, it's amazing that all these graduations are going on and we don't see it on the news. And that's on purpose. I feel that they don't want to let, just showing Black and brown walking across these stages or when they go into trade school. So it's a lot of negative, but there are a lot of positive outcomes. And thanks to great community centers, churches, people that care, all over the America, but there are a lot of positive outcomes also.
Yes, yes, indeed. And I don't mean to diminish that at all. There's a lot of people who succeed in spite of all these chips stacked against them.
There's always both sides to it.
Yeah.
Always, always.
That's true.
I'm not sure.
We have another
your
hand.
Name, safe Zoom account. You have your hand raised.
That's me. Hi, my name is Lashare, program coordinator here at the Family Justice Center, and I really enjoyed this webinar or training. It has really given a lot of insight because of the years. I guess, with the data, it kind of takes a while to kind of catch up to where we are today sometimes.
Yeah.
But it first really gave me a lot of insight, like with the whole the generational wealth and how it's not valuable at the time when you have kids, right? You don't see it till you're older a lot of times. But it really helped me kind of put in perspective like the experiences of like my uncles or my fathers or my grandfather per se, and what times were like then. And I know there are a lot of people who have persevered through these things, but it really also gives me insight when working with males now, because a lot of the conversations we've been having with working with fathers and males, I'm always looking for like, tell me what to do right now. Like, how can I better facilitate these conversations or, contribute to the work of these conversations when really it's this information you need first. Like, you have to first really understand where you've come from to really help with where you're going. And having a lot of this context surely helps, should help, I feel like it will help me when even interacting with my male counterparts or my relatives or my brothers or the people that I work with in community. Excuse me. So I'm really grateful for the information that you shared. I'm really looking for how to implement it in the work that we do here at the Family Justice Center, because we deal with a lot of women mostly, but there are a lot of men, of course, who need and deserve assistance. But being Black, there's so many similarities at the same time. So I just thank you so much for the information that you shared.
My pleasure. Thank you for your comments.
So we are at time. I want to obviously respect your time. Arnold, once again, I just appreciate the way you deliver such heavy and dense content. Like I say it all the time, I haven't seen anybody do it in any way close to you. Your handle on the information is remarkable. Thank you to everyone who had time to join us. Please, if you have not already, click the link in the chat, complete the survey. It is very important that we get your feedback. And Arnold, I'm really looking forward to the new report and presentation that you put together based on that report and presentation. So please keep us posted when that's ready.
Yeah, we'll want to work with you on distribution. So anybody who's going to want to distribute that report, we're developing partnerships around that. So if that makes sense to you, that's definitely something we'll talk about.
It definitely does, for sure, for sure.